Coming up next on the Wet Fly Swing podcast.
I had one of those flies that I developed, the Hampshire Warden, sitting on my table in a frame. And some guy came over and he started in and had an audience with him on how I didn't know how to tie that fly. And he just went on and on about, you don't know what you're doing. And then, he had no idea. He had no idea the connection between me and that fly. And finally, someone grabbed him and said, I don't remember what his name was, said, that's Scott. He was the one who developed that fly.
That was Scott Biron with a funny story about the pattern police. Back to the Northeast with some classic flies and classic stories today on the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
Hey, how you doing today? Thank you for stopping by the show. It'd be great if you can to share this episode out with one other person if you can today. Click that share button down in the bottom in your app and just send a text message. Send it out if you think you're going to enjoy the show or come back at the end. And if you enjoy a little bit of history, then you probably will enjoy this episode as we mix in a little bit of fly tying as well. Bearvault has the perfect solution to keep your provisions secure while heading into the backcountry this year. Bearvault builds a rugged locking canister that keeps bears and other wild animals away from your food. Proper food storage is one key to an epic trip in the backcountry. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/bearvault to check out a must-have solution for your next outdoor trip today. That's wetflyswing.com/BEARVAULT. Bearvault. LakeLady Rods builds distinctive, unique, and custom rods, each created one at a time to the exact specifications for you. LakeLady only uses world-class, top-of-the-line components and products. You can check in with Chris and check out some of the good stuff he has going. I've got a super sweet 9-foot 4-weight that is exciting and beautiful, all in the same package. If you want to check this out and check out what Chris has going, head over to wetflyswing.com/LakeLady right now. That's LakeLady, LakeLady. Check it out right now. Scott Biron is here to take us into some history of the fly tying and names that have paved the way for some major fly patterns and some books. We dig into some tips on tying classic flies, who the company right now that's producing the highest quality hackles for some of these old school flies, and some big historic names along the way. We're tracking down a few more guests and a few more historical nuggets for you today. So here you go, Scott Biron from nhflytyer.com. How's it going, Scott?
It's going great. How are you, Dave?
I'm good. We've got sunny weather here today, so I'm excited for the day. It's always good when we get started and there's sunshine out. So how about you? How are things looking up in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, we're raining right now, and we're we had an interesting winter. We didn't have a whole lot of snow here, so they're already talking drought and things like that. But most of the ice is starting to pull off the lakes in the middle of New England, and shortly it'll be pulling off the upper New England and northern New England area. So it'll be, weather is weather, right? It changes every day. So
I know. It's interesting you say that because you're up in New Hampshire. I'm over on the West Coast right now. And actually yesterday I was talking to somebody who was saying the same thing. They're like, well, we're expecting a drought this year, even though it doesn't, doesn't seem like it. But we just had like a bunch of rain this winter. But anyways, that's weather. And today we're focusing on, what you have going with these classic flies and some of the history. I love the history whenever I get a chance to dig into it, and we've had a couple of history lessons and episodes. And today we're going to dig into some streamers. So before we get into all that, you have a website, you do a lot of stuff out there in this space. Take us really quickly back to how you first got into fly fishing, and then we'll take it into the classic streamers.
Yeah, I was really lucky because my family, my grandfather he was from Berlin, New Hampshire, and Berlin, New Hampshire was a mill town. Was one of it supplied all the newsprint paper for the entire country at one point, and they had mills up there, and of course they were polluting the water and whatnot. But above the mills, they did all this logging, and on this one river up there called the Androscoggin River, that there was tremendous fishing. It was incredible, and they would move the logs down every year, and I think they stopped moving the logs in the '60s. But my grandfather had a camp. He had one of the first camps up there that was on the Androscoggin, up just below Errol. And as a young boy, I was, not allowed to be on the boat with the older guys when they went out and fished. And so my dad would go out there and fish, and my grandfather would go out and fish, and uncles and whatnot. And I would, stay back on the dock because it was supposed to be safe. And one day I was digging around and I found a fly rod in the camp, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I went out there and I started fooling around, and I caught a couple trout. And these guys came back in, and they were like, yakking. They were French Canadians, so they weren't speaking much English, and they were talking about the lack of fish. And I said, "Oh, look, I got fish here." And they were like, "What?" And that's kind of how it started. And at about the same time, there was a small fly tying kit in the camp. It had been my father's, and I started fooling around with it, and then it just kind of sprung forward. And I've been fly fishing pretty much exclusively since then. I certainly, there are times when I saltwater fish and don't fly fish or something like that. But for the most part, even when I bass fish and whatnot, I fly fish. So that's how I kind of got into it, and it just sprung. I mean, the fly tying piece I learned on my own for a long, long time, and then when I was a PE teacher in school for 20 years, and I would teach the kids how to fly cast in class. It was one of the 3 or 4 lessons, and people loved it. I mean, there were parents that would come to me and go, "My kid doesn't want to do anything with me, and now they want to go fishing." I'm so happy. And
that's really cool.
Yeah, and so I had fly tying clubs, and I do a lot of instruction, and I got awarded the grant. State grant for a traditional arts program probably 5 years ago. And I was able to study some classic New England streamers with another Tyer. We set up a whole curriculum for us to work on. And I really got bitten by the history piece. And since then, I've become a juror Tyer, and I have people who apprentice under me and whatnot. But it's been great. So I was able to dig in, and I knew some of these real historic Tyers. I grew up with one that was 2 streets over from me in Massachusetts. I went to high school with his daughter, and it just all of a sudden it opened up door after door, and history and why things were going on, and why these guys were tying this way, and so it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. No, I love the high school. It reminds me of my dad. It's similar deal when he was a teacher in kind of a high school and middle school teacher, and he did the same thing. He taught them. In fact, the same thing, like fly tying, and it was just this really cool. He was like a math teacher and stuff, but he would have kids that would, fly fishing was his passion. So before he had the business, he kind of taught them all that. But
yeah, and they love it.
Yeah, they love it. You find those people that love it. And I remember when I was in high school, because of my dad, I had a bunch of teachers, my teachers who fly fished, and they kind of knew my dad. So I was the kid tying flies for my PE teachers back in high school, right? So it's really a cool little place. So, and you mentioned the apprentice and what was the Tyer program you worked on?
Yeah, so it was, it's part of the National Endowment for Arts that in this state, one of the areas that they have available is called traditional arts. And so it encompasses a bunch of different areas. I mean, there's people who do like duck carving, wooden duck carving. And, so what they're trying to do is not lose the art of tying. As all these materials and all these different tools come available, you lose some of the construction that originally was done on some of these flies and whatnot. And I have what I call the pattern police that troll out there the internet, and they try to find things wrong with everything. That's not the way it was done. People don't realize that these Tyers, these older Tyers, they weren't as lucky as we were. Their orange feathers, depending upon what dye lot it was, it could have been, that orange could have swung from dark to bright, over the course of, 2 months. So, a lot of it is how the birds suck up the dye in their feathers. And, the program was kind of cool because what I did was laid out what Tyers I wanted to work and look back at some of their information. And I was tying, there's a big lake here in New Hampshire called Sunapee. It's very, very historic lake. It had its own Sunapee trout in it. It doesn't anymore, but I was tying a pattern called the Purple Smelt at a old home day on Lake Sunapee. And this older gentleman stood in front of me for about 20 minutes. And finally he said, "Where did you find that pattern?" And I said, "Oh, it's a pattern from a guy from Keene." And I went on and on. And I told him the whole history. He goes, "My grandfather used to fish that fly, and that was the only one that caught any fish on this lake way back when." And, you learn something. I'm like, okay, sit right down. Tell me about your grandfather. What was he doing? And you learn all that history. It's going away. And that's why the traditional arts program was kind of, it's kind of cool.
That's great. So it's there to secure and document some of the history, which is amazing. And so we're going to dig into that. I wanted to get into the people and some of those people that are probably, gone now, but talk about them. But before we get there, let's just go to a classic for those that don't know exactly, a classic streamer, because streamers are pretty popular these days. But what makes a classic streamer classic? Just start there and talk, because you see these long hooks, long shanked hooks, and kind of big heads. And is there anything that you could look at and be we're the police online looking at these flies? What is a classic streamer?
Yeah, well, it basically, for the most part, it's trying to imitate a smelt. And the lakes that have the salmon in them up here, the landlocked salmon, have a smelt population, because as the smelt population goes, the salmon go. And so these classic, commonly called Rangeley streamers, because of the Rangeley, Maine region where they were born, they are all different shades, different variations of smelt or small bait fish that might be in these big, big lakes. And, the colors that you see that often attract people are totally different when the fly gets wet. And people don't realize that, that was the crux of everything was really, when these things get wet, what they look like, and what they look like at different times of the year, different days, when it's overcast, when it's sunny. Remember those, if you're trolling on the top, like right now, when the ice goes out, the smelt are all on top and the salmon are all on top because the water's cold. If it's real bright out, those salmon are looking straight up into the sun. And so, the coloring that they see, maybe the profile of those Rangeley streamers is what they're looking for. Some lakes have pin smelt; they're small, so you don't have the really long hook. Some of the lakes have huge smelt in them, and they use tandems. They use hooks that are put together by wire, so that they give you that longer profile. So that's what you would consider classic, and I think materials will help it become classic as well. Some of the materials have gone away. We just don't get them anymore. But others, the synthetic stuff has its place, and there are people who use it, and there are people who imitate classic streamers with all the synthetic materials, which is fine. Because in the end, I have a friend who's a retired game warden, and he always says, in the end, it's up to the fish, not us.
Yeah, it's up to the fish. Yeah, when I think of the classics, I think of just in general, like you said, a long hook, whatever it is, 3X, 4X long, you've got a thin body, and then you've got this hair wing on top, and then the thread head is like a nice bulbous, big, juicy, head. That's kind of my picture of it, right? Is that pretty much most of them look?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think back in the 80s, the heads were all big. And the reason was they were tying with 3/0 thread.
Oh,
and
right.
now they have thread that's so small. All of a sudden, back, early 90s, late 80s, everybody went to a smaller head streamer. But if you go like to the American Museum of Fly Fishing and you ask them to see Carrie Stevens flies, you would look and you'd go, oh my God, that really is not what the book, when you look in a book, it looks like. Well, yeah, because, they dress it up with photography, but, some of these heads were pretty rough. Most of these Tyers, really great Tyers, were very rough. Their finished product was to fish with. It was not to be put in a frame on the wall.
So a rough Tyer, and how does a rough Tyer become a great Tyer? Or I mean, if they're tying a rough pattern, how do they get in? Yeah.
It catches fish.
It catches fish, bottom line. That's just the.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great, he's been dead for a while. He actually put New Hampshire on the map. Jim Warner. He was from he had a shop in Wolfboro, and he had the Winnipesaukee Smelt, which was a pattern that had a marabou wing, which gave it so much action in the water. And he had loads of different creative patterns that, people would go fishing and they would pass right through New Hampshire and go to Maine. And Jim started to develop these patterns, and all of a sudden people started fishing Lake Winnipesaukee where his shop was. Well, Jim was a rough Tyer. I know, I have friends who knew him, and, I have videos of him tying, and, his heads weren't beautiful. The flies might be slightly different, each one, in size, in length, but they caught fish. And that's what drove those people. And there were times I can remember, he would say, a guy would come into his shop and, he said, I agonized over tying this beautiful gray ghost. And the guy would go up to the board and pull the gray ghost off. He would take it out of the cellophane wrapper, throw it on the ground, put his foot on it, grind it into the ground, pay him for the fly. And he said he wasn't 20 yards off my dock and he already caught some. He goes, but, it was just, the way these guys developed their patterns, they were made to fish. They were made to hold up. So, they put a lot of effort into gluing them and really making them bulletproof. Because once a salmon or a big brook trout hits your streamer, they rip it to smithereens. And sometimes you can fish all day with a beat up fly and catch more fish than you can with a perfect looking one. So,
yeah. And how do you spell that? Winnipesaukee?
Well, yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah. I'll have to look it up and tell you.
I'll put it in the show notes. I'm just curious. So you mentioned Jim Warren. I've heard of that name before. You also mentioned the Gray Ghost. Who is the Tyer behind that one?
That was Carrie Stevens. She was a woman from Rangeley, Maine area. And she's very interesting. She had oodles of different patterns. Her husband was a guide, and she was just in an area where you can't turn around without bumping into another, perfect spot to fish. And, but she was a milliner. So she used to do the feathers for hats, men's hats, different women's boas and different things like that. Well, Carrie Stevens, she came up with all these great historic patterns that have stood the test of time. But the interesting part was she did not tie with a vise. She held the hook in her hand and assembled everything in hand. And so one of the things that she did was she would assemble all her feather pieces before she actually tied them on the hook. And when she did, she created what is known today as the Rangeley style, where when they mount the wings, that beautiful wing that you see on the fly, she mounted them. They were slightly off on the side, not on the top of the shank of the hook. They were probably, 2 and 10, 3 and 9 when they got mounted. But what it did was the very head of her flies, the first third of her feathers were very secure because they were all really glued together. And it gave the back of the fly a lot of action. And that the theory behind that, because no one probably ever thought to ask her, but the theory behind that was that it looked more like a fish swimming. And then there's a whole line of what they call Eastern type streamers, where they actually mount the wings on top of the shank of the hook. And those are, they're very effective as well, but it's a slightly different process.
Slightly different. So
yeah.
She did that on purpose to tie it on the side, slightly sideways?
No, I think she did that. I mean, I can only give you what I think and my personal. I think that was the only way that she could really assemble those, but without having a vise, without having bobbins to hold her thread, and
Yeah, that's cool. And who would be the person if we were going to talk to somebody to nail that down? Is there anybody out there that's connected to Carrie?
Well, the Hilliards wrote a book called Carrie Stevens, the maker of Rangeley favorite trout and salmon flies. They did so much history, a father and son. The father has passed away since, but they did a lot of history and information on that. So they probably would have some, greater detail than I have on that because they just focused on that. But there were other people there was a curator at the museum, the American Museum of Fly Fishing, that took one of her patterns apart with a fellow by the name of Mike Martinek, who's since passed away. And when they took it apart, they realized that she was mounting those wings on the side and she was adding some different things for stability. And that changed. All of a sudden, they got that next layer that peeled away the onion to understand a little bit more how everything was constructed. And then there were people who were tying her flies, mounting the wings on top, that went, oh man, that's not the way it works. So, we need to do it back the way she did it. And the Hilliards did a great job with that book. It was outstanding. So
Perfect. Yeah, I'll put a link to the show notes to that book if I could find it out there. And I love this top versus side. This is the stuff, definitely I didn't realize. And it makes sense. Yeah, you put it on the side. Obviously the hook is going to change the way it swims. And, well, we got a couple of people here. Let's go down a little list of people, maybe people and flies that you think, are interesting out there. And are we talking, if you think of what from classic Tyers from the past, I mean, are there lots of people, or is this a small list of people you think of that are kind of big names?
I think it's a small list. I think there are small list of people who had the foundation patterns, I guess I would say, the ones that really laid the groundwork. There are definitely niches where there were people in Grand Lake Stream, Maine, that might have had 2 or 3 or 4 patterns that they specifically adapted for that area, but they weren't as widely accepted initially. But Jim Warner, Carrie Stevens, they just had tremendous amount of patterns. I grew up in a town in Massachusetts, in Acton. There was a guy who lived 2 streets over from me, Ray Salmon, and Ray was really, really plugged in on the fishing and fly tying. He developed the Red Ghost and did a lot of research on patterns and different things like that. Joe Bates, who wrote the classic streamer book on streamers, they were great friends, and he helped to document some of this stuff that was just eroding away. It was a lot. How fly fishing is, no one shares the information a lot. It's a secret pattern we can't tell you. And unfortunately, that's what I found. Some of these patterns, they had kind of gone away, and people never share them. And so, when a Tyer passed away, that was it. You didn't, But there was another fellow from Keene, New Hampshire, which is kind of a southwest area here, and he was a fellow named Ora Smith, and he was a postman, and he tied flies, and he used to fish in Winnipesaukee and Sunapee and whatnot in New Hampshire, and he developed a whole series of just, I would say, there's probably 1,000 different patterns, but that are around that are documented, there might be 200-300 left that you could find information on. Every once in a while, someone will call me and go, "Oh, I went to an auction and I got this $3 kit, and there's these flies from Ora Smith in there," and I'm like, "Can you tell me about it?" And I'm like, "Send me pictures and I'll fill you in on as much as I can." And every once in a while, there's there's one that like I mentioned, this Purple Smelt, and there are people who have tied the Purple Smelt, and they've tied it purple, and it was a lavender. It was called purple, but it was really lavender wing. And some of these fly manufacturers, the dyeing companies, they stopped doing lavender. And probably about 6 years ago, a company named Ewing came to me and said, "Hey, could you do us a favor? Could we market some feathers under your name, but could you come out with some of the traditional colors?" So the first one I got was that lavender one. And I said, "Hey, can you just get this as close as you possibly can?" And I had a few Purple Smelts that Smith had tied, and I sent them the fly, and they knocked it out of the park and matched it. And thank goodness, there's been people that were like, "Gee, I always tied it, a traditional purple color, and now I realize it really wasn't that purple. It was a lavender." So he had just tremendous, colors and different patterns, but they were working patterns. They weren't ones that you were gonna, again, frame and stick on the wall. They were patterns that really, were producers in the different lakes.
That was Ora Smith, right? And how do you spell that, Ora?
It's O-R-A.
Oh, yeah,
and
just Ora.
Traditional Smith. Yep. Yeah, and he was a older fellow. He's passed away a while back. But his streamers, there are still a lot of them around. You see him every once in a while. There was a big auction with him.
Yeah. What was one?
He had a really cool fly. You'll ask me how to spell it. I probably can do this one for you. It was called the Canopache. And basically what it was it's just kind of a cool history story. He tied about 18 golden pheasant crests for the wing of this fly. The body of the fly was basically a silver with a red ribbing, and he had a guinea hen kind of roof, just short roof on the golden pheasant. And he had developed this fly, and he was up on Lake Winnipesaukee, and he was fishing with it, and he had a tremendous day. And he came off the dock, and somebody asked him, "What's the name of that fly?" And he said, "Canopache." And then I remember listening to him talk one time, and someone said, "Well, how came that?" He goes, "Well, I was staying in the Canopache camps in Wolfboro, and I had developed this fly, and I was just trying it out, see how it worked, and it worked really well. Someone asked me, I called it the Canopache." So there's a road still up there. The camps are gone, but there's a road up there called Canopache Road. And but that was one of his probably really, I would say well-known patterns. He also had a Maynard Marvel. There's 2 Maynard's Marvels in New Hampshire, 2 different styles, but I'd say the Canopache. He was really, really kind of a cool fly. Very high producer. Very high producer.
And the Purple Smelt was also his?
Yep, Purple Smelt was his. Yep.
Angler's Coffee. Roast a full range of coffee with one goal in mind. You know it, delivering excellent coffee to every single angler. Responsibly sourced from farms using sustainable growing practices, you can rest easy knowing you're doing your part. and also roasted and shipped within 48 hours to assure freshness. I recently tried the Kenya AA coffee from Anglers, and it was very good as well. I know this is Joe's personal favorite, and it might be mine soon. How to describe it? It seems like all the coffee is just smooth. Joe can probably do a better job trying to explain all the goodness inside, but you're going to have to check it out for yourself. If you want to support this podcast and support a sustainable, amazing coffee with great tasting coffee, you got to check out Anglers. They got it going. Anglers Coffee right now. wetflyswing.com/anglers will direct you right over to Anglers Coffee. Check it out. You support this podcast by clicking over to Anglers online.
And you mentioned, and I want to follow up, keep going on this list here, but you mentioned Ewing, the feathers, and I think I connected with them at one of the shows. Talk about how that came to be. Is I know Ewing, they're kind of, you hear a lot about the Whiting Farms and some of these other big companies, but they've got some good stuff going out there, don't they?
Oh yeah, Ewing, both Doug and Cole are involved. They own the company and whatnot, and they reached out to me about streamer patterns. Streamers for some reason became kind of reemerged, and there was a large popularity. Different companies, different growers, their birds develop different, and their wings get different shapes to them and different colors and whatnot. And so I had said to them, I'd be happy to help you. I don't get anything out of it monetarily. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't lose these, colors and whatnot. And so I sent them some shapes of feathers that I was looking for. And I sent them about 22 colors the first round. And they came back with probably 30 colors. And out of that, I'd say about 18 to 20 were just right on, absolutely. And so we dyed them up, and I started tying with them, and we got them locally available in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine, just because that's one of the areas where these flies are very popular. So that, the market's higher for those feathers. We had shops like North Country Angler up in North Conway that had them, and I know Dette's has them as well.
Yeah.
But they started to get traction. And so I would, try to pick off like every couple months, a couple new colors and put them out there, or experiment with colors and different things like that. And Ewing really has done an excellent job. They're very responsive. They're very easy to work with. Their birds are consistently the same shape with their feathers. And so we started to, work together, and it's been great. They've got a pretty good presence, and they just don't make the feathers for the ones that I tie with. They have a whole line. They saltwater feathers, that flat wings that the saltwater fly tyers love, and they have a whole line of hens. And the one thing that they didn't have for the longest time was badger. And I was always clamoring with them about badger. And they actually went out and bought a line of badger. And they sent me a picture of the chicks the other day. So very shortly, we'll have some badger to play around with.
There you go. So they're rolling. So good.
Yep.
That's a good resource, and I'll put a link to them as well.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep going to this list. So we got a few people here. Who else should we be thinking about when we think of the classic streamers?
Yeah. So the other, one of the other Tyers that he passed away just recently in the New Hampshire area was a fellow by the name of Ellis Hatch. I think if I have to look back, he was probably the last great production Tyer that we had here in New Hampshire. I mean, it just would produce flies like for everybody in New England. I remember talking when he passed away. I remember having a conversation with Tom Rosenbauer at Orvis, and just said, "Do you know Ellis passed away?" He goes, "Nicest guy I ever met." He used to come in with his flies to Orvis when I was running the retail shop, and he said, he would just lay them out, and we never said no. They were every one of them looked exactly the same. Well, Ellis was great because he had a connection with some of these. He kind of bridged my generation with some of the generation of the original fly tyers, and he knew some of these guys. And I can remember being, going over and sitting with him for a day, number of times, and he would just spew out history. And it was like, you would sit there and go, oh, this guy, one of his fingers has more knowledge about fly tying than I'll ever have in my entire body. It was amazing. So he was another guy that, he would tie some patterns that you never would see because they kind of just went away. And then, there were other tyers, like I said, that had patterns, small numbers of patterns that were out there. It just wasn't the volume. And, Eddie Reef had the Ripagina Smelt, and Herb Welch had the ghost pattern from Rangeley, and there were all these little nook tyers that Rangeley Region Fly Shop. There was a guy by the name of George Fletcher, and he had a whole bunch of different patterns that he tied, and he was the one who dyed all the feathers and provided Carrie Stevens with all the materials from her flies. So Mike Martinek was a fellow who passed away probably in the last 5 years, and he was just beautiful streamers, and he fished all over New England. He knew Jim Warner. He was able to be around. He was another bridge that knew some of the older patterns that were still around, and the guys, male or female, that tied them, that developed them, and some of the, why were you doing this? Why did this pattern come about? And like Carrie Stevens, she's patterns that are named, Rapid River, and that was a fly that was used on the Rapid River.
Oh, right. Well, let's go down that for a second. So let's take it to the flies. Let's go to, say, if you had to grab your, 10 flies that are the classic, fly. You mentioned one, obviously the gray ghost. But what would those be?
Yeah, gray ghost would be the number one.
Number one. And why is the gray ghost? Why is the gray ghost number one?
Well, I think it probably covers the coloring of a smelt when it's in the water, maybe 70%, 75% of the time. One of the things that people don't realize, and this is why the coloring of some of the flies have changed, is the salmon sometimes will run the smelt up on these sandbars to try to ambush them, because they kind of move in schools, and so they'll try to ambush them up on these sandbars where they can kind of pin them, and just we'll troll for salmon, not to get off the subject, but you'll catch one and you'll bring it to the boat and net it, and you'll look and you'll be pulling your hook out, and there'll be 30 smelt in the salmon's mouth that they haven't even digested.
No kidding.
It's like, it's dinner time for the next 2 weeks, and we are just going to eat. And that's the mentality. And so when they would ambush these smelt up, their coloring would change. It would go from that gray of the gray ghost, that gray kind of bluish, purplish, yellowish, huey color. Yep. It would go to more of a tannish color. They're almost when you get a smelt in your hand, you almost look at it and say, you can almost see through this thing. They're very delicate. There's not much to them, but I think that's why the gray ghost, because 90% of the time these smelt are moving in a pack, and they're on the, very close to the top of the water early season, and they look gray. And I think that's why that pattern is so effective. So, and it stands it's stood the test of time. People have used the feather wing. They've used marabou for the wing. They've used synthetic for the wing. But that gray coloring has stood the test of time.
And it seems like the feather wing is the classic. I mean, that when you think of it,
Yep.
right, that is the classic wing. It's the feather wing.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just harder to tie, and it's harder to get it to be as exact. So I think as time went on, I remember Jim Warner had a pattern that he made out of marabou, and he was trying to wean people off of the gray ghost and onto this marabou pattern, because obviously it was easy to tie, faster to crank right out. He said never worked. The feather wing was what everyone wanted. Yeah.
No, yeah. The feather wing
so
looks
Great
cool.
Ghost would be, I think, number one. And I think everybody has their opinion on what, the ranking would be. But I think I would say the Winnipesaukee Smelt would be another one that had a white wing with a silver pheasant crest on the top of it, that and a really strong silver body. And boy, I'll tell you that fly, when it gets wet, it is just so slick. And boy, that is a very high producer, and it's a pattern that's really strong. The one I talked about, the Canopache, that's another one. It gives you that yellow goldish color with some red, and that red sometimes is the trigger, because a lot of times when you're trolling for salmon, they'll hit your fly, and then they'll circle back around, and then they'll come up and they'll actually engulf it, because they will injure those smelt, because they're moving so fast, and they'll look for that injured one. So sometimes a pattern with a little red in it will be one that it'll look injured, so they'll come after it. And then there are patterns, like there's a pattern that Carrie Stevens had called the Morning Glory, and it's probably one that you don't see. You see it in a frame. I guess that's the easiest thing. You don't see it in a fly shop that often, but boy, oh boy, the first 2 weeks of salmon trolling season, that fly is money. It just really, really, really works. And then flies that had she had one called the Blue Dragon. She had one called the General MacArthur. They had almost like a baby blue coloring with it. The Blue Dragon had orange with the baby blue. The General MacArthur, which was for General MacArthur, who was World War II general, that had a grizzly wing blent in with it, and the grizzly gave you the par marks that you would see in a small bait fish. And people see the General MacArthur again in the frame. But boy, oh boy, that fly produces. It's huge. And and then there were flies like Indian Rock that she had. There's a camp and up on one of the lakes up there in the Rangeley region, and there's a rock that they call Indian Rock. And this was a olivey, orange, reddish base, just brook trout magnet, and every once in a while I get an order out. Somebody will call me and say, can you tie Indian Rock? And I'm like, yes, sure. I love that fly. And it worked.
What does that describe, that Indian Rock? We can look it up. We'll put it in the show notes as well, but describe what that one looks like.
Yeah, it's kind of the best way to describe it is it's tied on it's tied on like a 9X.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So most of Carrie Stevens were 9, 10X, 7X hooks, and like the hooks today, Partridge is the leader in those long hooks. A lot of companies gotten away from those hooks. She was tying on Alcock hooks, and the Alcock, there's an English, we'll digress here, little hook history quick.
Yeah.
So Partridge was in Redditch, England, and there were a number of hook manufacturers. They just didn't make hooks. They made all sorts of different wire-based products, but Alcock was one of them. And in World War II, during the Blitz, most of these places got bombed because they stopped making hooks and they were making armaments for the English. And so the Germans bombed the factories, and the only one that survived that went back into business was Partridge. And that's why they have that heritage of hooks, because they really, they continue to manufacture those long trolling hooks along with all their other hooks. And they've always done it. Today they use Swedish steel, not Japanese steel, much stronger. It's like almost impossible to break those hooks. And they will bend before they will snap, where some of the more modern hooks that are out there, they will snap and break. It's just, whatever.
Yeah.
So the 9X, 10X hook that the Indian Rock was tied on, it was a long brook trout hook. And, it had peacock curl, which is always used as kind of a lateral line, imitation of a lateral line, but it has, it's got some red hackles that are flanked by an olive hackle. And when you look at that, when it's dry, it kind of gives you that almost like Christmas tree, Christmas green and red. But when it gets wet, it gives you that coloring, kind of like the bait fish that was getting moved up on the sandbar. It's kind of an olivey color, and it's got a white belly. Most of Stevens flies had a white belly underneath them because most bait fish have a white belly, but boy, time and time again, there are people who will come back and say, man, I never knew that fly. I saw that. I grabbed one of them. You tied up a bunch of different flies and you threw one of those in. And that was the best producer I had all week,
Yeah. It's a cool looking fly. Yeah. It's pretty much red. It's red and it's got the peacock underneath, like you said.
Yep.
And it's a good fly. Is that one? And it's got, the little white underbelly and the long hook. Okay. Yeah. That's really cool. So that is a good example. I mean, that's traditional. And when you're looking at those hackles, if you're trying to tie one of these, is it a challenge to find the right hackles? What do you recommend to get that good hackle that makes the streamer pattern?
Yeah, so well, Ewing has them. So that's the Ewing line that have the streamer saddles.
This saddle, it's just a big streamer saddle. You just ordered up.
Yeah, they have originally. I didn't realize this when it was happening, but originally they produced a line under the Tyer Mike Martinek, and then at some point, both of them, both went their own way. And then at some point, they came to me and asked me. And I think Mike was probably really involved with, the early feather construction and coloring and different things like that. But a good saddle hackle is going to be one that you're getting a cape. So you're not just getting the feathers loose, because typically you're taking feathers from the left side as you look at it, and they will be opposed by the feathers from the right side when you construct it. And you want to look at the shape of the feathers. Today a lot of people, more is what they want and less is more in fly tying. So you want to make sure that the feathers have the right shape, that their stems aren't like telephone poles, because some of these flies will have 4 feathers on each side to build a wing. And those stems, if they're too big, I mean, you're trying to take these big, when I teach classes, I'm always telling them, you got to think of these as rods. They're like rods, and you're putting rods up against a round hook. And if you don't have the whole base constructed the right way, it's never going to come together the right. It's going
Yeah.
to start rolling. It's going to fall apart. Your hair will hurt by the second wrap you have on it. So you have to really,
Where would somebody go if they were going to, if they wanted to learn to tie these correctly? Is there, I mean, obviously you have classes, but is there, what resource or where would you direct them if they're listening now, they're in some part of the country and they wanted to learn more about this?
Yeah, I will tell you, there are a lot of different organizations that will bring in Tyers to demonstrate and to teach. And I will say, in all honesty, that I have been more involved with getting a phone. I'll give you a funny example. Ludlow, England. They do not tie classic streamers and fish with classic streamers in England, right? They reached out to me, they're a fly tying club, and they said, hey, would you do a demonstration online? Next thing I know, the guys from Ewing and the guys from Partridge are calling me on the phone going, you did this demonstration. All of a sudden, we are selling more feathers and more streamer hooks in England than we've ever done in our entire life. But I think the whole thing is, there are a lot of YouTube videos that are very good, but if you can sit with a Tyer, even if it's on Zoom, and watch them do it and listen to why each part is being done, that will help you to learn how to tie. And I know we've done it with the American Museum of Fly Fishing. We've done a couple Zoom, Facebook Live, different things, and they've been really well received, like 7,000 hits in the first 15 minutes with people watching it multiple times. They're like, these people are watching it multiple times. I think you could, the Hilliard's book, the Carrie Stevens book, that's got a lot of construction methods. They tried to break hers down, but there's really nothing like being able to be with somebody or able to ask a question while something's going on, because it's I feel lucky I was a teacher, that there are a lot of times when I'm able to break it down an extra level, because I'm like, hey, if you don't get this part right at the very beginning, then you're really going to have a lot of trouble. Because one of the first problems that I see in fly tying these classic streamers is that everyone tries to assemble all the materials at the head right behind the eye. And really what Carrie Stevens, Mike Martinek, and all these other Tyers did was they did something almost like shingling a house. When I start a classic streamer, my thread starts about 2 wooden match heads back from the eye. Mm-hmm. And that's where I start laying my materials on, because I build one material goes a little bit further towards the eye than the last material. Because if you have everything at the very head of the fly, it's not only huge, but when you finish tying it, you can take your fingers, pinch it, and rotate it right around and pull it right off.
Oh, right. Yeah, you're doing the overlap. That's a great tip. So you kind of doubly reinforcing it. And stuff, when you're dealing with stuff like some of this, it has a throat of bucktail, right? That's hard. That's not the easiest stuff to tie in.
Yeah, like I got a fly right now in the vise that I'm working on, and a blue dragon. Yeah. And it's got 4 peacock herl, and then it's got white bucktail, and then it's got orange hackle, and then it's got blue hackle, and that's the bottom. That's just the bottom. We're not. Oh,
that's the bottom.
That's the underbelly and the throat.
How is the hackle when you say blue hackle or the under, or it's under? So you're not spinning that hackle all the way around, or are you spinning?
No, it's just the throat. It's just like a little.
So you're ripping off some fibers, and then you're tying in those fibers.
Yep, take it off a nice piece of Ewing hen, and but each level is a little bit forward. Each material is a little forward of the last material, and it's And I think I honestly think, and someone probably will correct me because there are the police out there. They love to troll the internet. But yeah, the pattern. I call them the pattern police, but they,
That's right. So who are the pattern police? When I think of this, Scott, the pattern police, I mean, you could be the pattern police because you know more. I mean, who are these people that are the police if it's not you?
Yeah, I don't know. They might have been connected to a Tyer way back when, or they learned a certain way, and they just don't want to budge off, their what they know. And this is a very, very true story. I was tying. I had developed a pattern called the Hampshire Warden. One of my friends, who I mentioned before, Rick Estes, was a game warden, and he had done the district chief. And what he did was, it was a streamer pattern that was fashioned off the game warden's day-to-day green uniform in New Hampshire. And they also have this beautiful red uniform. And so I came up with the New Hampshire Warden, which had the base of it was the red. There was also a fellow from Maine named Charlie Mann who had the Maine game warden fly. These are, they're beautiful flies. I'm sure they would catch fish, but they're more of a presentation fly. Well, I was at a show, and I had one of those flies that I developed, the Hampshire Warden, sitting on my table in a frame. And some guy came over, and he started in and had an audience with him on how I didn't know how to tie that fly. And he just went on and on about, you don't know what you're doing. And
on your own fly, on the fly you invented.
Yeah, he had no idea. He had no idea the connection between me and that fly. And finally, someone grabbed him and said, I don't remember what his name was, said, that's Scott. He was the one who developed that fly. And the guy just turned around and walked away.
Yeah.
And, I never really negatively comment on anybody on the internet.
No,
because I want, they're doing their best at this.
Yeah.
Some of these people will, they'll send me a picture and they'll say, oh, I was so inspired to tie this fly that you posted on the internet. And, what does it look like? And I'm like, you did a great job. And I try to find the 3 best things of the fly and say, these are the 3 best things. And if you want to work on one little thing next time, try this. And so, there are the pattern police, and they get out there and they look at the flies and, that's not right because of this. And,
that's cool.
It's unfortunate, but that's the way it goes.
Dette Flies was established in 1928 and is the oldest family-run shop in the country. We've got another history-filled episode here, and it's just another reminder of the good history that Dette has going and has had going on for a long time. They're located in Livingston Manor on the banks of Willowweemaw Creek. Dette, it's your welcoming place, online or on the creek. Dette Fly's inventory consists solely of products that meet every angler's demand for high-quality service. And, of course, they offer fly fishing, casting, and guided trips. For more information, head over to wetflyswing.com/Dette, or you can give them a call, 845-439-1166. That's wetflyswing.com/DETTE. Check them out right now.
I love the tip. You've mentioned a few, the scaling or the shingling of the fly. That's a great tip. And we've talked in the past about the harrowing, tying that on, because that's a big challenge. Are there any other couple of tips you might throw out there if somebody's trying to tie these that are common struggles?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when they assemble these flies, one of the things that they do is they don't glue the wings together. And that was what Carrie Stevens did. She had to glue the wings, and she used, I'm sure, some lacquer or
like
nail
polish,
like
head cement or something like that.
Yeah. I happen to use, I've tried a bunch of different things, and I happen to use tear mender, which is a latex-based fabric repair. And for me, I like it. It can get gummed up a little bit quick. You have to kind of, work your way through using it a little bit. And once you get the method down, it really works. I used to use some stuff called fabric fusion, but I actually assemble a Rangeley style fly using those. So like the fly I'm tying right now, it's got 2 orange inner wings with a shorter blue outer wing, and then it's going to have a tan and white piece of partridge for the shoulder. All 4 of those feathers are all glued together. And then I put the jungle cock eye on after I get the wings mounted. I think Carrie Stevens actually had her jungle cock glued together when she put it on, but I kind of like to fuss with that at the end a little bit. That's just my
yeah, walk through that real quick on the gluing. So basically you have these feathers, you're matching them up like you match 2 feathers or 4 feathers.
I match them up.
And then what do you do?
Then I put, I'll take the 2 orange feathers. I'll maybe on this fly, I run the tear mender from where the stem becomes bare up along that stem. I'll run that tear mender, maybe say, no more than between 1/4 and 1/2 inch up. It's all going to be covered by the shoulder anyways, and it all dries clear. So I'll run a small bead, and then I'll press the 2 orange feathers together, making sure the tips are lined up perfect. And then I'll run another bead on top of that second orange feather, and then I'll put the blue feather on top of that and press it together. And then I'll take the partridge shoulder, which is shorter, and I'll run that maybe 1/4 inch of the tear mender up, and then I'll put the partridge feather on it, and then it'll dry as fast as by the time I do the opposing wing and glue that one together. And then that just then sometimes the Tyer will put some tear mender in between the insides of the wings when they mount them on the fly, but oftentimes you don't need to do that. If you build your wing correctly, you put the opposing wing on first, and then you bring the near side wing up and assemble that. And when you put the wings on, because remember they're going on the side of the hook, I just put 2 wraps to put my opposing wing on. So I have the far side wing on. It's held just gently in with 2 wraps. Then I put the near side wing on, hold that in with 2 wraps, and I kind of take a look at it. How's it mounted? Does it look good? Are the tips lined up? Do I have to make any adjustment? Then I repinch everything with my fingers, and then I wrap towards the eye, and that's when I really snug it in. I usually bring a wrap around and then pull straight up with my bobbin 2 or 3 times, and that really sets it in place. And but if you if you try to put too much tension on the round stems before you have them in position, then they start to roll all over the place. And, you really, that's the part when you said, how do you learn? That's the part that it's really hard in a YouTube video. Somebody doesn't want to take the time to explain that because they'll lose their audience. A lot of those YouTube videos, people want to see the fly constructed. Boom, front to back. Boom, oh, that's great. Now I'm going to do it. But they don't get the in-between piece that Tyer knows how to do. They just didn't want to take the time to explain it because people would have said, click, I'm going to the next video. And,
oh, right. Well, you know who does a good job of that we had on was Tim Flagler.
Oh, Timmy does a great job. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we talked about that. We mentioned, I was asking about that, and he said the one thing a lot of people miss out there on YouTube and these Tyers things is that they don't cover all the steps, and he has multiple views, so you'll see him setting up. Like this would be, I'm sure, example where he would set up, show you, not on the vise, but down below how he's gluing these wings, right? And he said that's like 50% of the pattern.
Right, and that is a great comment because when I've done these Zoom meetings for people, one of the things that I've done for them is before the meeting, I actually produce a small video with still pictures that I send the club or whatever the group is and say, this is how the wing assembly looks. Don't do it yet, but read this, because when you're going to be looking at this while I'm doing it, so you can refer to it and actually see it. And I will tell you, some of these English fly tires, they are classic salmon, Irish salmon tires, and they,
Right.
understand construction. And in a matter of 2 weeks, they have nailed how to tie a Rangeley streamer, because they just listen. They use their previous tying experience. And one thing that they found is they will say, oh, I didn't realize how important the right feathers were.
Yeah.
Like there's a company in 54 Dean Street. They're in Italy, and they sell Ewing feathers. And they got hammered by all these guys because they wanted to learn how to tie these flies. And they got the feathers. They were tying with just, strung saddle. It was a mess. They couldn't figure out why their wings wouldn't mount. And then they got the right saddles, and they're like, holy cow, now I can tie these flies. So I tell everyone to hook. You want to tie flies. The most important thing is your vise, your hook, and your scissors. And then you got to get good materials. But if you don't have the first three, you can have the best materials in the world, and you're going to be
Mess up. What's your vise, Scott? Give us what are you using there for a vise?
I've always used a Regal. I have a Regal Revolution right now. I've always used Regals because they grab the hook and hold it, and there's not a lot of fussing.
Yeah,
they were a local company, and there are other great vices out there. HMH is a great vice. But I've always used a Regal.
Me too. Yeah, I love the Regal. I've got a few vices, but the Regal's just always been so simple. It's just like easy and simple. And we got the partridge hook and then the scissors. What's your go-to scissors?
Yeah, Sprite, which is part of Partridge, and they have a line of hooks. I probably should have said, the Partridge hooks or the Heritage hooks. They have all the hooks, and Sprite is there. Sprite is a line that is, more affordable. Well, Sprite's got a whole line of tools, and they have a nice pair of scissors. I've been using the scissors from the Coppler ones. I think that's the from Italy. Those are really nice. They're great little scissors. The Coppler ones I've used. Some stainless ones from Dr. Slick, and
exactly. There's a ton of like that. There's so many different great tools out there. It's it's interesting for me just to hear what people are using. So that gives us a little snippet on it. So I want to get back.
I will say one thing about scissors. I do have multiple pairs, and I have some that I use for like cutting bucktail, and I have some that I use for trimming the end work on flies. So, that's the one thing that I think makes a difference, is that you don't use your scissors that you're trying to trim the last bits before you lay your head in. You don't want them to be the ones that you're cutting wire and bucktail with, because it gets really, really dull quick. So I have multiple scissors that I use for, different processes. So.
Okay. And before we wrap it up out of here, I wanted to touch on, I want to just finish that list of people we talked about, but I'm curious on the fly. So are people out there with these classic flies still, is it just a small little subset of people fishing for salmon or, these landlocked salmon out there? Or are most people using kind of more of these newer kind of articulated and more, I'm trying, you know what I mean? Like, are there still lots of people using these long?
You know what I think? Honestly, I think they're, I think when you see some of the new different materials and different products that are out there, I think people jump at that. They vacillate. That's the new. Yeah.
That's a new thing.
That's the best. We got to go get that. That's the Mercedes-Benz or whatever. So we're going to go after that, and that's the way to go. But in the end, the classic Rangeley streamers have stood the test of time. And they are the ones that I am shocked to hear people come back and tell me that they took all these different flies up, and the one that worked was, the one Indian Rock. They just said, I fished everything and none of them worked. It was just this one fly, and I fished it and prayed I wouldn't lose it because that was the only one that was catching fish. And, so yeah, I mean, and the 10 top could be changed by the temperature of the water,
exactly.
But
this was just kind of a little bit of a taste for people out there, and obviously Carrie Stevens' name comes up a ton, always. And I was kind of thinking too on this line of, I think of steelhead fishing. I've done some stuff in the past up in, especially up in BC when I first kind of got going using these really long 3/0, 4/0 hooks. But there's been a change in some of the fishing there. The fact that those long hooks, when they get in a fish, they can kind of, because of the long shanked hook, it can kind of do some damage. And I was curious if, if that's something you've thought about, and if maybe that's why people are going away from this.
Yeah, and the salmon, the landlocked salmon up here have a very tender jaw, and they have a really hard time repairing an injury to their jaw. And a lot of times somebody will hook a salmon and it won't be the legal length, and they'll let it go and they've injured the jaw. And then someone will recatch that salmon and the salmon never grew because it spent all its energy trying to close that wound in its mouth. And the wound's still there. It just couldn't fix it. So what we do is the barbs are all crushed on the hooks before they're fished. And again, that's one of the things I think I would really pound my fist on the table and say, when you crush the barb on a partridge streamer hook, it's not going to break. And a lot of the lesser quality hooks out there, when you crimp the barb, it actually breaks it makes it weaker. That becomes the weakest spot in that hook. But if you do play the fish correctly, and if you do remove the hook correctly, then you're going to be in pretty good shape and not injure the fish. It's not like a big largemouth that will inhale a bass bug down to its colon, for crying out loud, because it's so hungry. These salmon are pretty much hooked in the mouth, and in some places in Maine, they want you to take every salmon you catch out of the lake because there's too many salmon in the lake, and that's how they manage the resource. But here in New Hampshire, you're limited to how many fish you can take and what the length is. But you just have to. There's a salmon anglers pledge here in New England that you can take, and it explains. You got to do some things to manage the resource here. You got to use a rubber net with these fish. You got to, be careful when you're unhooking them, and you got to be smart. And I think most fly anglers really want the resource to remain. So
I think it's the education. I think it's the education piece. People don't. Sometimes they don't know, and that's why the education comes in. Do you think? I love that you went on this track. I'd like to take it out here just with kind of the, the conservation kind of minute here, if you can. I mean, are there any, like in your neck of the woods, you've mentioned, New England, Northeast part, a lot. Is there any conservation or nonprofit you'd like to shed some light on here as we take it out of here?
Yeah, I'll kick one off. We have a group here in New Hampshire, and they have them in a lot of the states, but it's called Operation Game Thief. And basically it's it's an organization that's out there, produces a lot of information on, signage, on, different specific rules and regulations, but it's a link between the law enforcement end of the game wardens and the public. If you see somebody, taking over their limit or mismanaging, whether it's hunting or fishing or, lobsters from you can call this number and, produce it, give a tip and they'll, they'll get right on it. And I'll tell you this group works hard to get the information out. And, there are national organizations, Trout Unlimited and different groups like that have a bigger resource. But some of these smaller organizations that are operating in, their own state, Maine has one, we have one, Vermont has one, they're really out there. And I know a lot of the fly anglers, because they really want to be able to go out and catch fish all the time. They, if it's fly fishing only and they see somebody dunking a worm, they'll pick that phone up and call the 800 number and boom.
Yep. That's our Operation Game Thief.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. We'll get a number, a phone number in for that if people are up in your neck of the woods. So cool, Scott. Well, I think I feel pretty good. I think on our list we had, we went down when we were talking about the flies. I think, half of them were Carrie Steven. I guess that's kind of what it's all about. She's kind of the big name. And then you've got Jim Warner and a few other people. But really, there's not a ton of people of those really big names that everybody knows about out there.
Yeah, no. And the ones that just had the ones or twosies, they were great flies for their area and whatnot. And, there's nothing wrong with not downplaying them, but, or they just didn't get popularized or didn't have the, Carrie was lucky. She was, her real estate was right in the lakes region of Maine where there was just so much fishing going on. And it was just, the brook trout were huge, the salmon were huge. And, it was the right time. It was like the 1980 Olympic hockey team, right? Everything came together perfect,
right.
And so, that's the way it is. So her stuff is the stuff that everyone remembers, and a lot of things were copied off of or modeled off of that. And, that's why so many of her flies are still the most popular ones.
That's why it's it. And we'll leave maybe more of that conversation for a future episode to dig in more specifically to more of Carrie's stuff. But this has been great, Scott. I'll also note we had an episode way back, episode 8, many years ago now, with Darren from Piscator Flies, and he had this program he talked about. It was called Streamers 365.
Right. He had the books produced and everything. Yeah, he did a great job with that.
Yeah.
He had a lot of those flies in there are historic flies of Carrie Stevens and different Tyers. But if you go through that, all the 365, I bet you most of the flies, the historic ones were hers.
Oh,
and
really?
Then everything else branches off that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. So literally, it all starts with this period. And when was Carrie Steve? Just quickly, what was her period?
Yeah. What was her period? I'm looking at her book here. Does it say?
I'm trying to think.
18. It says 1882 to 1970.
Oh wow, 1882. Wow. So that's like her. She was born.
Yeah, she must have been born in 82. So you're talking early 1900s, probably 1920s, different things like that. 1920s. That's when,
amazing.
Yeah. 1924, I'm seeing different things written here in the book with and I'm sure there's a ton of patterns out there. I know Leslie Hilliard told me this once. I was looking there's a pattern called the bee pond. And it was a wet fly, and it is a little pond up in Rangeley Bee Pond, and it was great brook trout salmon pond. And he said that Carrie Stevens tied 30 bee pond streamers commissioned for a group of fly tyers or fly fishers down in Massachusetts. And I said, "Oh, what's the recipe?" He goes, "Scott, we've never been able to find it." And he said, "I'm probably looking at that fly somewhere in all the ones I have of hers, but we can't nail and connect that it's really the bee pond streamer fly."
Yeah.
So there's so much still out there we don't even know.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's a good way to leave it off, that there's more that we'll dig into later. So we'll send everybody out for you to nhflytyer.com, and they have questions for you. But I just want to thank you, Scott, for coming on and sharing some wisdom and history on streamers, and looking forward to keeping in touch.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
So there it is. There it is. Another one down in the books. Sealing the deal. wetflyswing.com/326. 326 if you want to get the show notes, the links, and maybe a bonus video if you check it out right now. Listener spotlight. I want to give a spotlight out to Dick Sargent. I chatted with Dick on the phone this week and had a great conversation. I got a little insight into his steelhead and spade journey. Sounds like he is having a lot of fun out there. He's actually up out of Massachusetts and has been hitting some good steelhead water and has been refining his craft with the trout spay. So it was really cool to hear that. So Dick, I want to thank you for being a listener of the podcast. I want to give you a super big virtual fist bump right now. Boom. Okay, as always, you can check us out if you are on Spotify. Would love it if you can share that out. I'm not sure if they make it easy, but if you can do that, that would be great. And yeah, we're going to be moving on to the next one. And I appreciate you for hanging in with us all the way to the end. Hope you check out the next episode we have coming. And if you get a chance, send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com. Would love to hear if you had a chance to listen to this episode. Looking forward to seeing you on the water or online.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.